Hi everyone, this is the second part of my three-part sequence on the big three macroeconomic topics. After covering GDP in the first video, we'll now turn our attention to inflation and unemployment. We ended the first video by calculating the GDP deflator and using it to calculate changes in the price level over time, which is referred to as the inflation rate. Indeed, using the GDP deflator is one way to measure inflation. However, as mentioned in the previous video, the inflation numbers discussed in the news is not based on the GDP deflator. The downside to using the GDP deflator is that it takes all products produced in the entire country in a given year into account. However, the typical American household does not buy every single product produced in the United States. Therefore, the inflation rate based on the GDP deflator is not relevant to most Americans. Instead, we want to calculate the inflation rate using the products that a typical American household actually consumes. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is a measure similar to the GDP deflator, but only takes into consideration the products that a typical household purchases. In order to determine which products should be included, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, surveys 14,000 households on what they buy. Based on this survey, the BLS has currently determined 211 core products that are purchased by a typical urban family of four. The BLS refer to these 211 core products as the basket of goods. BLS employees then visit thousands of stores across the country each month to record the price for each of these products. This pie chart shows the breakdown of purchases made by the typical urban family of four. Unsurprisingly, housing takes up the largest chunk of people's budget, followed by transportation and food. I was surprised that apparel came in at only 3.6%. I guess I personally do a lot more shopping than the typical American family. So if using the CPI to calculate inflation is more relevant, then how does it get calculated in the first place? In order to calculate the CPI in a particular year, we need to know the basket of goods, as well as the price for each product in the base year and the year of interest. Similarly to the GDP deflator, CPI is then calculated as the expenditures in the current year divided by the expenditures in the base year, then multiplied by 100. Just like with the GDP deflator, the value for CPI is equal to 100 in the base year. Let's suppose that we simplify the basket of goods to consist of three products: eye exams, pizzas, and shoes. Let's use 1999 as the base year in this example. Then the total expenditures in a particular year is the sum of our spending on the three products. Since we're using 1999 as the base year, the expenditures in the base year is $750. Similarly, we can calculate the expenditures in 2012 and 2013 to be $900 and $915 respectively. Remember that the CPI is calculated as the expenditures in the current year divided by the expenditures in the base year, then multiplied by 100. The CPI in 2012 is then 120, whereas the CPI in 2013 is 122. In order to get the inflation rate from 2012 to 2013, we use the rate of change calculation, remember new minus old over old, times 100, to get an inflation rate of 1.67%. Recall from the first video that GDP generally increased steadily over time. This graph used data from Fred to show how the inflation rate changes over time. Notice how much the inflation rate fluctuates. We have been recently living in times of generally low inflation of around 2%. However, the inflation rate was in the double digits in parts of the 1980s and 1970s. More importantly, notice how inflation generally decreases during recessions, which are illustrated as gray vertical bars. More on that in the video for part 3 of this chapter. Let's now talk about unemployment, the third and final big three macroeconomic concept. The BLS reports the country's unemployment rate on the first Friday of each month. In order to understand their calculation, we need to start by discussing four important labor concepts. First, to count as being employed, you must be 16 or older and working. Second, to count as being unemployed, not only must you be 16 or older without a job, but more importantly, you must also be looking for a job. The labor force consists only of the employed and unemployed. In other words, students, retirees, and people not looking for work are not included in the labor force. Finally, the unemployment rate is calculated as the number of people unemployed divided by the labor force, then multiplied by 100. The resulting number gives us the percentage of the labor force that is unemployed. Just like with the inflation rate, the unemployment rate has been up and down over time. We are currently at around 5%. More importantly, notice how the unemployment rate increases during recessions, which are again illustrated as gray vertical bars. This flowchart uses data from the BLS in August 2013. Of the 245.9 million people in the United States that were 16 or over at the time, 155.5 million were part of the labor force. As I mentioned before, some people don't have a job and aren't even looking for a job. We don't include these people in the labor force and refer to them as discouraged workers. Notice that the flowchart here identifies nearly 1 million people as discouraged workers in August 2013. The next slide focuses on the portion of this flowchart associated with the labor force. Of the 155.5 million people who were in the labor force in August 2013, 11.3 million did not have a job, yet were actively looking for a job. Therefore, the unemployment rate in August 2013 is calculated as 11.3 million divided by 155.5 million times 100, which is equal to 7.3%. We will be combining the trends for GDP, inflation, and unemployment during recessions and expansions in the third and final video for this chapter. Before proceeding to part 3 of the 3-part sequence, I encourage you to take some time playing with the Excel spreadsheet I provided on Moodle to make sure you can replicate the calculations covered in this video. Remember, you'll be able to use the Excel spreadsheet on the final exam, so it's in your best interest to make sure you are comfortable with the calculations introduced in this video. Feel free to email me with any questions that you have.